Before the Civil War ended, before the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, before most of the American Midwest had been touched by industry, the state of Michigan was covered in one of the largest temperate forests on Earth. Hundreds of billions of white pine trees, some of them over 150 feet tall and older than the country itself, blanketed roughly 38 million acres of land across the northern half of the state. The forest was so dense in places that sunlight barely reached the ground. It had taken thousands of years to grow into something that enormous. It took 30 years to destroy all of it. By the year 1900, Michigan's white pine forests were effectively gone. Not thinned out, not reduced, not damaged. Gone. One of the largest logging operations in the history of the world had swept through the state like a slow-moving wildfire, consuming everything in its path and leaving behind a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. However, the most disturbing part of this story is not just what happened, it is how it happened. Because the destruction of Michigan's forests was not the result of some accident or miscalculation. It was the product of a perfectly designed system built by governments, railroads, and financial institutions that made wiping out millions of acres of ancient forest not only possible, but enormously profitable. A system that knew, at almost every step, exactly what it was doing. This is the story of how that system worked and how it ate an entire world. If you want to see more deep dive historical documentaries like this one, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss one. We cover the stories that most history classes skip entirely, and trust me, there are a lot of them. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what was there. The white pine forests of Michigan were not just trees. They were an ecosystem that had been developing since the last ice age, roughly 10,000 years ago. As the glaciers retreated northward, they left behind a landscape of sandy soil, cold rivers, and a climate perfectly suited for one particular tree. Pinus strobus, the eastern white pine, moved into that landscape and never left. White pine is not like most trees. It grows fast for a conifer, reaching heights of 150 to 200 feet under the right conditions, with a trunk that can stretch 5 or 6 feet across at the base. The wood itself is soft, straight-grained, and incredibly easy to cut and shape. It does not warp badly, it takes paint well, and it is light enough to float down a river. For a 19th century America that was building cities at a rate never seen before in human history, white pine was not just a valuable resource, it was the perfect resource. Michigan's forests held an estimated 150 billion board feet of white pine before the logging era began. To put that number in some kind of perspective, a single board foot is a piece of wood roughly 1 inch thick, 12 inches wide, and 12 inches long. 150 billion of those, stacked end to end, would circle the earth more than once. It was a volume of timber so enormous that even the people who would eventually cut it all down initially assumed it was essentially infinite. The forests were home to wolves, wolverines, black bears, and an enormous variety of bird life. The rivers running through them, the Muskegon, the Au Sable, the Manistee, the Saginaw, were cold, clean, and packed with brook trout, lake trout, and grayling. These were rivers that fishermen from across the eastern United States were already traveling hundreds of miles to reach, because there was almost nothing else like them on the continent. The Ojibwe and other indigenous nations had lived alongside these forests for centuries, using them in ways that left the ecosystem largely intact. They harvested timber for canoes and shelter, hunted the animals that lived within the forest, and fished the rivers in ways that maintained the populations of everything they took from. They understood, through generations of direct experience, that the forest was not a one-time asset to be depleted and moved on from. It was a living system that required balance to survive, and that if you destroyed the balance, you destroyed everything that depended on it. That understanding would carry no weight whatsoever in what was about to happen. By the 1830s, the U.S. government had already displaced most of Michigan's indigenous population through a series of treaties that are difficult to read today without a sense of grim irony. The land was cleared of its human stewards, the people who had managed it sustainably for centuries, and handed over to a civilization that had no interest in sustainable management. Within a generation, the same land that indigenous peoples had protected for centuries would be stripped clean by an industrial system that could not have imagined, or at least chose not to imagine, what it was actually destroying. By the 1840s and early 1850s, the northeastern United States was running low on timber. The great forests of Maine, New York, and Pennsylvania had been significantly cut over, and the rapidly growing cities along the Atlantic seaboard were consuming lumber faster than the remaining eastern forests could supply it. Someone was going to look west eventually, and when they did, they were going to find Michigan. The first commercial sawmills appeared in Michigan's Lower Peninsula in the 1830s and 1840s, mostly clustered around river mouths on the western shore of the state, where logs could be floated down from the interior. In those early years, the operation was relatively modest, almost cautious by comparison to what would come later. But the fundamentals of the system were already in place, and within 20 years, those fundamentals would produce something that no one had quite seen before. The decade of the 1860s changed everything. The Civil War created an enormous demand for lumber across the country, driving prices up and attracting capital investment into the Michigan timber industry at a level it had never seen before. At the same time, the federal government was selling and granting away millions of acres of Michigan forest land at prices that, in retrospect, border on the absurd. Individual timber companies and land speculators were acquiring vast tracts of virgin forest for as little as $1.25 per acre through the federal land sale system. In some cases, through grants to railroad companies and other legal mechanisms, they were getting it for even less than that. The price mattered enormously. When a company can acquire 50,000 acres of forest for the cost of a modest house, the calculation it makes is very different from the calculation it would make if that land cost what it was actually worth. The federal land pricing system was not designed with forest conservation in mind. It was designed to move land into private hands as quickly as possible, and it did that with considerable efficiency. The lumber camps that emerged across northern Michigan during the 1860s and 1870s were industrial operations that would be recognizable to anyone familiar with modern factory production. They ran on rigid schedules, employed specialized labor divided into precise roles, and were optimized entirely around one metric: how many board feet of timber could be cut and moved in a day. A typical camp would employ between 50 and 200 men, depending on the season and the size of the operation. There were fallers, who cut the trees down. There were buckers, who trimmed the branches and cut the trunks into manageable lengths. There were teamsters, who moved the logs from the cutting sites to the riverbanks using oxen and horses. And there were the river drivers, perhaps the most physically demanding job of the entire operation, who rode the log drives down the rivers each spring, guiding millions of board feet of timber to the mills at the river mouths. The work was extraordinarily dangerous and paid almost nothing by today's standards. Most of the workers were recent immigrants, primarily from Canada, Scandinavia, and Ireland, men who had few other options and were willing to endure brutal conditions for wages that still represented more than they could earn back home. They worked 6 days a week from before sunrise until after dark, in camps that were cold, crowded, and far from any town. When they were injured, which happened constantly, The camps provided minimal medical care. When they were killed, which also happened regularly, the company moved on. Camp life was organized around maximum output and minimal comfort. The bunkhouses were long, low buildings, heated by a single central stove, and the men who slept in them, sometimes 60 or 80 to a building, were packed together so tightly that personal space was a luxury that did not exist. The food was plentiful by the standards of the time, because a logging operation needed men who could sustain hard physical labor. But the living conditions, by any other measure, were grim. Letters home from loggers who could write described the camps as something between a prison and a factory floor, a place where you worked until you could not, then worked some more. The men who did this work were not villains. They were poor people doing the only work available to them in a labor market that gave them very little choice. The system that employed them, however, was making choices of its own. The rivers were the key to everything in the early logging era. Michigan's interior was still largely inaccessible by road, and moving hundreds of thousands of logs overland was not practical with the technology of the time. But the rivers solved that problem elegantly. Each spring, when the ice broke and the water ran high with snowmelt, the logging camps would roll their season's cut into the river and drive it downstream to the mills. The river drives were chaotic, loud, and genuinely spectacular events that drew crowds of spectators from miles around. They were also an ecological catastrophe happening in plain sight, as millions of tons of logs scraped and scoured the riverbeds clean, destroying fish habitat and reshaping the waterways entirely. The mills waiting at the end of those rivers were increasingly sophisticated. By the 1870s, the sawmill towns on Michigan's western shore, Muskegon, Manistee, Ludington, and others, had grown into genuine industrial cities. Saginaw and Bay City on the eastern side of the state were even larger. At the peak of the boom, Saginaw was processing more lumber than any other city in the world. The mills ran 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they were always hungry for more logs. The railroad changed the game again in the 1870s. Before rail access reached the interior of the state, logging was limited to watersheds that could be used for river drives. But as rail lines pushed northward through the lower peninsula and eventually into the upper peninsula, suddenly entire swaths of forest that had previously been untouchable became accessible. The logging frontier moved faster, reached further, and hit harder than anything that had come before it. In the year 1869, Michigan produced roughly 2.5 billion board feet of lumber. By 1882, that figure had nearly tripled to around 6 billion board feet in a single year. The state accounted for more than a quarter of all the lumber produced in the entire United States during the peak years of the boom. The system was running at full speed, and almost nobody in a position of authority was asking whether it could keep running. If this kind of deep dive is hitting different for you, share it with someone who would appreciate it. History told straight, without the textbook version, tends to land better when more people are watching together. And while you are at it, drop a comment below telling us what forgotten chapter of history you want us to cover next. To understand why no one stopped what was happening, you have to understand who was building the system and what they were getting out of it. The state and federal governments of the 19th century operated on a philosophical foundation that treated natural resources primarily as obstacles to development rather than assets to be managed. The dominant economic thinking of the era held that undeveloped land was unproductive land, and that converting wilderness into commerce was not just profitable, but morally justified. Cutting down a forest and turning it into houses and businesses was, in the language of the time, improving the land. The idea that the forest itself might have long-term value, not just as timber, but as watershed protection, soil stability, and habitat was not part of the mainstream conversation. The federal land policies that enabled the Michigan timber boom were not accidental. They were deliberately designed to transfer public land into private hands as rapidly as possible. The Homestead Act of 1862, the Land Grant Railroad Acts, and the existing federal land sale systems all pushed in the same direction. Private ownership, it was assumed, would develop the land efficiently, and efficient development was the goal. That this framework handed enormous amounts of irreplaceable forest to buyers who had no incentive whatsoever to manage it sustainably was a consequence that the policymakers either did not see or did not care about. The financial institutions that funded the logging operations had even simpler priorities. A bank that lent money to a logging operation expected that loan to be repaid, with interest, on a schedule that had nothing to do with the pace at which the forest could regenerate. Forest investors were not thinking in terms of decades or generations. They were thinking in terms of cutting seasons and mill runs. The economic logic of the system pushed relentlessly toward extracting everything as fast as possible because any tree left standing this season was a tree that a competitor might get to first. The timber industry's relationship with the state legislature was also worth examining carefully. During the peak boom years, lumber was Michigan's largest industry by a significant margin. It employed more workers, generated more tax revenue, and held more political influence than any other sector of the state economy. The politicians who might theoretically have passed conservation legislation were the same politicians whose campaigns were funded by the people who owned the mills and the timberlands. The alignment of interests was not subtle. When state legislators were asked to consider timber regulations in the 1870s and 1880s, the bills went nowhere, quietly killed in committee, or simply never brought to a vote. The system had ways of protecting itself. Competition was fierce and essentially unregulated. Michigan had no meaningful laws limiting the pace of timber extraction during the boom years. The state government, whose coffers benefited substantially from the economic activity the logging industry generated, had no political incentive to slow things down. The counties where logging occurred were economically dependent on the industry. The politicians who represented those areas answered to constituents who had jobs because of the timber business. Regulation was not on the table in any serious way. The people who ran the timber companies were, in most cases, responding rationally to the incentives the system created for them. They had acquired forest land cheaply. They had access to cheap labor. They had buyers for their product. The laws allowed them to cut as fast as they wanted. Every board foot they extracted that season was profit. Every tree they left standing was a risk because competition was intense and the boom could not last forever. The rational move, given the system they were operating inside of, was to cut as fast as possible and move on. That is exactly what they did. The logs that fed the mills were not replanted. The land behind the logging crews was not managed. There was no systematic effort to preserve seed trees or protect riverbanks. The entire operation was designed around a single pass model. Move in, cut everything, move out, find the next stand. When the white pine in one watershed was gone, the crews packed up and moved to the next one. When the lower peninsula was largely cut over, the industry pushed north into the upper peninsula. When that was gone, it would push into Wisconsin and Minnesota. The system did not have a plan for what happened after the last tree fell, because the system was not built to have one. By the mid-1880s, something was becoming impossible to ignore, even for the people running the industry. The cutting crews were having to travel further from the mills to find timber. The logs coming down the rivers were getting smaller because the large, old-growth trees were already gone, and the smaller second-growth timber was what was left. Mill output was still high, but the operators who paid attention could see the trajectory clearly. The forest that had seemed infinite 30 years earlier was running out. Faster than almost anyone had publicly admitted, the end was coming into view. The final phase of Michigan's logging era, roughly from the mid-1880s through the mid-1890s, has a quality to it that is hard to describe without using the word desperation. The industry did not slow down as the timber ran out. It sped up. With the knowledge, at least among those paying attention, that the supply was finite and the end was approaching, the pressure to extract whatever remained became more intense rather than less. Companies that had been moderately aggressive in their cutting methods became maximally aggressive. Timber that had been considered too far from rivers or too small to cut profitably a decade earlier was now being cut because it was what was left. The bar for what counted as worth cutting dropped steadily throughout the late 1880s. The railroads played a critical role in this final acceleration. As more rail lines penetrated the remaining forested areas of northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula, land that had been protected by simple inaccessibility suddenly became available. The railroad companies, many of which had received land grants adjacent to their lines, and had a direct financial interest in seeing that land logged and sold, pushed their tracks into the last stands of timber with considerable urgency. The railroad and the logging industry were, in many ways, a single integrated system at this point, each feeding the other's growth and collectively consuming the forest at a rate that no previous era could have matched. The Au Sable River watershed in the northeastern part of the Lower Peninsula was one of the last major white pine strongholds in Michigan. The river itself was famous among anglers for its cold, clear water and its remarkable population of trout. Fly fishermen had been traveling to the Au Sable since the 1870s, writing about it in sporting journals and calling it one of the finest trout rivers in North America. The logging industry reached the Au Sable drainage in force during the 1870s and 1880s, and within 2 decades, the watershed had been essentially stripped. The river runs that had once carried logs in the millions now carried the last trickle of a dying industry, along with the sediment and debris of a forest that no longer existed to hold the soil in place. The grayling is worth mentioning specifically here. The Michigan grayling, a beautiful cold water fish that was once abundant in the rivers of northern Michigan, was almost entirely wiped out during the logging era. The rivers it needed to survive, cold, clear, with gravel bottoms, were destroyed by the logging operations that scoured out the stream beds, raised the water temperatures by removing the shading tree cover, and filled the channels with silt and debris. The Michigan grayling was functionally extinct in most of its former range by the end of the 19th century. The last confirmed sighting in the wild was in 1936. A fish that had existed in those rivers for thousands of years was gone within 1 human generation of the logging boom. Nobody went to prison for that. Nobody paid a fine. It was simply one of the costs that the system did not put on any balance sheet. The workers who drove those last log runs down Michigan's rivers in the late 1880s and early 1890s were working in an industry they knew was ending. The camps that had once offered at least the stability of multi-year employment were now seasonal at best, and many closed entirely after a single season when the local timber was exhausted. The mill towns that had been booming cities began the process of contraction that would, in some cases, continue for decades. Saginaw, which had been the lumber capital of the world, began to see its mills shut down one by one as the logs stopped coming. Muskegon, Manistee, Ludington, all of them felt the same contraction. By 1897, Michigan's lumber production had fallen to roughly a third of its peak levels, and it would continue to decline sharply in the years that followed. The industry did not end with a dramatic final cut or a moment of recognition. It simply faded as the last accessible stands were harvested and the crews moved on to Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Pacific Northwest, wherever the next frontier of exploitable timber could be found. The system that had consumed Michigan's forests did not pause to consider what it had done. It moved on to the next meal. What it left behind in Michigan was a landscape that its own operators barely recognized. Millions of acres of what had been ancient forest were now a tangle of branches, stumps, and slash. The industry's term for the tops and limbs left behind after the trunks were taken. The slash lay in deep, dry piles across the logged land, baking in the sun through the summer months. The rivers that had once run cold and clear through the shaded forest now ran warm and brown with eroded soil, their banks collapsing and their fish populations crashing. The springs that had fed those rivers, maintained by the forest's ability to retain and slowly release rainfall, were slowing or disappearing entirely, as the forest cover that sustained them was gone. The land looked, to the people who saw it, like the aftermath of a battle, and in a certain sense, it was. The fires started almost immediately. Slash is extraordinarily flammable when it dries out. In the years following the major logging pushes through different parts of Michigan, the land left behind became a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The Great Fires came quickly. The Thumb Fire of 1871 burned roughly 1 million acres of logged-over land in the eastern part of the Lower Peninsula, killing dozens of people and destroying several towns. Another major fire hit the same region in 1881, burning even more land and killing over 200 people in one of the deadliest fire events in Michigan's history. Fire after fire swept through the slash-covered landscape throughout the 1870s, 1880s, and into the 1890s, burning not just the debris from the logging, but what remained of the soil's organic layer, the thin but critical crust of decomposed plant matter that made the land capable of supporting life. The fires were not a surprise to anyone who understood what the logging industry had left behind. The slash piles were an obvious fire hazard, and people said so at the time. However, the logging companies had no legal obligation to clear the slash from the land they had cut over, and doing so voluntarily would have cost money with no financial return. So the slash stayed and the fires came, and the people who lived on or near that land paid the price. Many of those people were settlers who had moved onto the logged over land with the hope of farming it. The state of Michigan and the federal government and the railroad companies that owned land in the cut-over regions all promoted the logged over land as ideal agricultural territory in the years following the timber boom. Pamphlets were printed and distributed, particularly in Europe, promising that the cleared land of northern Michigan was fertile, productive, and available for purchase at low prices. Thousands of families responded to that advertising, mostly recent immigrants from Scandinavia, Germany, and Eastern Europe, and moved onto the stumps and slash landscape of the former forest with the intention of building farms. What they found when they got there was a disaster. The soil underlying Michigan's white pine forests is, in most places, sandy and low in nutrients. The forest had been able to thrive on that soil because of the complex ecosystem it had built over thousands of years, with deep root networks, heavy leaf litter, and mycorrhizal fungi systems that made nutrients available in ways that simple crop plants could not replicate. Strip the forest, burn the organic layer, and what you were left with was sandy, acidic soil that would not support wheat, corn, or most other agricultural crops. Settlers who had invested their life savings in this land found themselves working soil that could barely feed them. The agricultural failure was not universal. Some areas of the cutover did develop viable farming, particularly in the more fertile areas of the northern Lower Peninsula. But for a large portion of the logged over land, the farming experiment was a prolonged catastrophe. Families who had borrowed money to buy land and equipment found themselves unable to make their payments. Banks foreclosed on farms that had never produced a viable crop. Counties in northern Michigan that had expected to become prosperous agricultural communities instead became centers of rural poverty that would persist well into the 20th century. The mill towns fared only marginally better. Cities like Saginaw, Bay City, and Muskegon had been built almost entirely around the lumber industry. And when the industry collapsed, the economic foundation of those cities collapsed with it. Sawmills that had employed hundreds of workers closed. The supporting businesses, the boarding houses, the equipment suppliers, the merchants who depended on the wages of mill workers, contracted sharply. Population declined. Civic institutions built during the boom years struggled to maintain themselves on a shrinking tax base. Some of these cities managed to diversify and survive. Saginaw transitioned partially into manufacturing and eventually recovered, though it never regained the economic dominance it had briefly held. Other communities did not recover. Dozens of small mill towns scattered across the northern Lower Peninsula and Upper Peninsula simply shrank to nothing, leaving behind names on maps that no longer corresponded to living communities. The ghost towns of the Michigan cutover were not the kind that make for romantic frontier mythology. They were the ruins of an industrial experiment that had burned through a place and left almost nothing of value behind. In the northern parts of the Lower Peninsula, you can still find the remnants of this era if you know where to look. Concrete footings where mills once stood. Cemeteries at the edges of fields where there are no longer any towns to tend them. Old plat maps from the 1880s that show dense grids of streets and numbered lots in places that are now just second-growth forest and scrubland. The infrastructure of a civilization that was built on the assumption that the resource would last forever, and that collapsed almost as fast as it had appeared. The forest itself did eventually begin to come back in places, though it came back differently than it had been. White pine naturally regenerates slowly, and in large areas of the cutover, the sandy, depleted soil favored other species over pine. Much of northern Michigan today is covered in a mix of aspen, birch, and scrub oak, a different forest than the one that stood before, less biologically rich and structurally simpler. Some areas within what is now the Huron-Manistee and Ottawa National Forests have been replanted with white pine. And in those places, you can find stands of trees that are now 80 or 100 years old and growing back towards something like the original forest. However, nobody alive today, and likely nobody living for several more generations, will see Michigan's white pine forests as they were in 1860. The rivers told the same story. The Au Sable, the Muskegon, the Manistee, and the other rivers that had once been cold, clear, and biologically rich ran warm, silted, and depleted through the former cutover for years after the logging ended. The trout fisheries that had been world-renowned before the logging boom were shadows of their former selves. The riverbanks that had been stable under the shade and root systems of the forest were collapsing and eroding. It would take decades before serious restoration efforts began on these waterways, and some of the ecological damage from that era has never been fully reversed. The land that had supported one of the largest temperate forests in North America, the land that had taken thousands of years to develop its extraordinary complexity, had been reduced in 30 years to something that could barely support basic agriculture, and the system that had done it was already looking for the next forest. The Michigan white pine story is one of the most complete examples of what happens when economic systems are built with no mechanism for saying enough. If this documentary made you think differently about how we treat the natural world, or about what gets called progress and what gets called cost, then share it, leave a comment, and subscribe. We will be back with more stories that deserve to be told in full. Thanks for watching.